Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. When I was preparing for the birth of my daughter, I began to understand just how multifaceted and paradoxical birth is, and how difficult it can be to talk about. Birth can be beautiful and it can be traumatic, often at the same time. It's intensely personal and highly political. It's something extraordinary that's also entirely ordinary. You give birth to a baby, and you also birth yourself as a mother, whatever that might mean. Another paradox is that birth has become much safer the past 200 years because of the advancements of modern medicine. And yet, that very medicalisation has also had serious downsides. Women who give birth in hospitals are more likely to have unnecessary interventions and traumatic births. And the amount of women who have physiological births, that is without any interventions, is rapidly declining. Is it possible to build a culture of birth that takes the best parts of modern medicine and combines them with a deep respect for the wisdom of women's bodies? Instead of seeing birth as a medical event, how do we best honor it as a rite of passage? My guest today is author and birth activist KRISTINA Turner.
This is not really a women's issue. Every single person is born, and how that happens matters profoundly for them and us as an individual and for us as a society.
I first came into contact with KRISTINA's work when she was featured in a Swedish documentary about home births. She's been an advocate for women's right to choose how they birth and is the author of books on healthy births. We talked at my house outside of Uppsala with teacups in hand. So, KRISTINA, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to come out here and to have this conversation.
Thank you, Ingrid. It's wonderful to be here on this frosty morning just north of Stockholm.
Yeah.
Beautiful setting.
It's very peaceful here, actually. Yeah.
It really is.
And I have so much that I want to talk to you about. I actually had a really hard time planning this conversation because, birth, it's so hard to talk about in a way because it's so personal and vulnerable, and at the same time, it's about systemic issues, about culture and society, and it brings up a lot of feelings for people that can feel very vulnerable. So I'm thinking that we'll just go gently and then see where it takes us.
Sure.
But I thought maybe you're an author and you call yourself a birth activist. Do you want to start by just saying a little bit about how you came to be doing this work?
Absolutely. Well, I was in my late 20s when I became pregnant with my first child. And by then I was already engaged in a spiritual tradition that allowed me to question some of the fundamental structures of Western civilization. So I think that was part of my preparation for looking at the birth of my children with more of an overview from a higher perspective, if you like, but like putting it in a historical context spanning thousands of years instead of the myopic view that we're raised within in this culture. So when I came to give birth to my first son, I knew I just had an inkling, an intuition that there was something problematic with just following the invitations and guidance from the system to draw me into what seemed to me like a very mechanical, cold process. So I had this kind of feeling that there was something I was wary about, but I didn't have the scientific understanding of it. I didn't have any knowledge of physiological birth. But I just had a suspicion that there was something slightly wrong with the system. So I looked at what the options were And at that time, I was living in Stockholm, and the only option to giving birth in hospital was a midwife-led unit adjacent to one of the major hospitals in Stockholm, Södersjukhuset. That unit was then called ABC-klinik, and it was an alternative birth clinic. So that was a midwife-led unit in direct connection with a major hospital. So I chose that. And that was all very good. You know, I labored at home for a long time, came in and eventually gave birth within 6 hours without any interference from technology or medical procedures. But, or rather, because that experience was positive enough, it was intact enough for me to realize that there was more to be had from birth, that there were, in fact, interventions and disruptions, even though they were so-called very minor. So make a long story short, I then went on to give birth to my other 2 children at home on my own premises with a home birth midwife, and basically did it unassisted with her in the room as a backup. And these 2 experiences, or 3 experiences, together with my spiritual training, led me to have profound initiatory experiences from childbirth. And we can go back to that in more detail later on, but that is the background. So there was something extremely profound that couldn't even compare to the years of study in the esoteric traditions that happened to me in just a few hours of giving birth, a really profound transformation in my inner world. So I wrote my first book, which is Natural Birth, A Holistic Guide to Pregnancy, Childbirth and Breastfeeding, based on those experiences, because I felt I needed to put it down on paper, what I'd experienced, because it was so big. And then when I started to speak to other people in the wider community, I realized that my experience was an aberration, you know, really a profound exception to the norm. And that the vast majority of those I spoke to had not very pleasant or even traumatic experiences, or just like, I never want to do it again, or you just go through it and then forget about it. And I realized that there was something fundamental missing in our culture in terms of the spiritual evolution of women in particular. So then my first modus operandi was to to try and change the system or inform people. So I did all the reading, read all the research, all the books I could find, and started to organize myself with other women who felt similarly, and lobby politicians, doctors, the media, and so on, so that the information about birth would be more balanced in our culture. That's really where the whole activism thing comes from. So that's why I sometimes call myself a birth activist. So then after doing that for about 10 years, I started to see that, wait a minute, it's not just the system that is the problem here. It is actually our collective internalized view of the female, what it means to be female, how we value it, how its processes are respected. And the result of our unconscious view of the female principle results in the structures within which we give birth in this culture. So then I started to organize women's circles, retreats, workshops, to try to increase the women's potential to have connection with their cyclical bodies, their hormonal systems, and themselves, and to start to allow themselves to listen and trust to the communication with the natural landscape of their bodies.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that these systemic issues, it's not just about informing people about, birth and the physiology of birth, but it's about these deeper cultural questions, because that's what I've been discovering as well in researching all of this, because speaking from my personal experience, I didn't really know very much about birth at all until I became pregnant myself 2.5 years ago, I would say it is, yes. And I just became really fascinated to see how much of, what I've seen when it comes to our relationship to nature and the need for control and the fear of the things that are, in a sense, unknowable, how strongly that came into birth. It was quite extreme. So I think that we will definitely get into that. But maybe we could start by talking about what you mentioned, which is how birth has been seen in our culture over the past, few hundred years or thousands of years, because it's changed quite a bit from being seen as, an important rite of passage to becoming something that is perhaps, it's become safer in a lot of ways, but it's also become more of a medical event rather than this kind of rite of passage. Do you want to say something about that, of how it has changed?
Absolutely. Yeah. If we go back 20,000 years into prehistory, we see clearly that a mattress-centric culture existed with a focus on the 13 menstrual cycles during a solar year and the 13 lunar cycles during a solar year, and birth and the vulva being venerated as the center of community and the source of life for obvious reasons. So from that, with the advent of the Abrahamic religions, we shifted into what is now commonly called patriarchal structures, which are not really anything to do with men today, because they are largely upheld by women. So I want to say that before I go on. But the patriarchal religion, where the God, the divine, became represented by the male principle, and we moved away from this focus of seeing the source of all life and the divine as being the birth canal, the vulva. We then moved through many thousands of years of religious control, but within that religious control in all the major religions, I'm talking largely from a Western perspective, of course, but so I apologize for that, but that is what I know. Within those religions, the female principle was still venerated, and women's work was still considered women's work, and women's mysteries were still considered women's mysteries. And birth and menstruation and these cyclical truths of female embodiment were left outside of patriarchal control. And therefore we had the traditional herbalists, midwifery skills were part of the women's mysteries and the women's work. So then where I see that it really started to shift was around the Enlightenment, when religion started to become questioned at a fundamental level with the discovery of, the telescope, understanding that we were actually in a heliocentric universe. And we started using our senses to observe the material world and analyze it and categorize it and systematize it. And what happened then with the advent of medicine, the male observing eye also entered the birth room. And the traditional herbalist, midwife, wise woman of the community, healer, which included spiritual, emotional, psychological modes of healing, was vilified and minimized in favor of a more rational intellectual analysis of the human body. So she was cast out as a witch or a superstition, and women kind of lost the agency over the mystery unfolding in their bodies during that period. And this is my opinion. And this was the time when autopsies started to be performed in operating theatres with an audience and so on. And including then, of course, autopsies of female corpses and looking at the uterus with a clinical eye and carving us up into body parts instead of seeing us as a spiritual system, living system. And with the advent of hospitals and doctors who spoke Latin becoming the authority on all medical issues, including childbirth, doctors were, of course, not aware of bacteriology. So there was no understanding of the perhaps ritualized cleansing, ritual purification, ritual cleansing of traditional midwives or herbalists before birth. And a medical doctor could go straight from an autopsy to deliver a birthing woman. And then we got these epidemics of infection passed from woman to woman because of a different approach to birth, and one that was to bring women to the convenient place of analysis, which was the hospital, where then illness and death increased and it became more dangerous to give birth. Of course, we need to also include an analysis of the general health of women giving birth and the maternity care they received. So you can't say that everything was fine and dandy before the Enlightenment, and that is certainly not what I'm saying at all. I'm just trying to give a broad brush historical overview of what seems to have happened with birth. And then, of course, we had Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor who conducted extensive studies in his hospitals run by doctors, including himself, and then a separate unit run by midwives. And he could not understand why the midwife unit had much better results until he worked out it's because they washed their hands.
Oh, when was this?
This was in the 1800s. Okay. I don't know exactly, but we do bring it up in the book, Revolution in the Maternity Factory. But he was utterly vilified and ridiculed and ended up dying a pauper in a mental institution, I believe, because it was too early and people weren't ready to listen and understand this. But this somewhere around this period in the transition between the Enlightenment and the industrialized age, that the processing of women in institutions begins. And then, of course, with the advent of technology, that was introduced into the birth room with the forceps and other methods of mechanized delivery. And it's really only in the past 100 years that childbirth has fundamentally, even in the countryside, moved out of the home. So it's a very new experiment. And we have very quickly become utterly incapable of giving birth, it appears. So that now a majority of women need to be induced or assisted in some way to perform, I don't like the word perform, to experience a physiological process that is largely reflex-driven when it is undisturbed and unobserved. It's spontaneous reflexes that happen to us through our intelligent biology that now are considered need to be taken over by medical procedures. So that's my historical bedside view.
Yes, and it's very interesting because we see that not just when it comes to birth, but in general with the incredible medical capabilities that we have today, which is some of it just feels magical, the things that they can do, that doctors can do in terms of, here's a new knee or here's a new hip or, lung replacements and et cetera. I find it so interesting that we have these wonderful advancements that have been done within medicine that can be so valuable, but at the same time, they have this destructive underside. And we can sort of get back to that. And I'm wondering if we need to talk a little bit about, before we get into sort of the problems with the medical system as you see it, or the birth systems that we have today. I'm wondering if we should talk a little bit about physiological birth. So that means birth without intervention, what actually happens in the body, so biologically, and also, what a healthy birth context looks like, because I don't think we actually know what it looks like now, because we don't attend the births of our family members or our friends usually. We don't see it in the media. Doctors don't see these kinds of births because they're called in when there are complications. And like you said, there are very few births today that are done without any interventions. And so even midwives will more rarely witness these physiological births. So maybe just briefly, can you take us through just the biology of and context for healthy births?
Sure. Well, it's really not that complicated. If we are healthy, we are like most mammals, well, like all other mammals, because we are a mammal, and we have an intelligent design. We have an intelligent biosphere, ecosystem of our own, with all the neurotransmitters, hormonal cascades, and complex internal communication that comprise our instinctive functioning. So really, an undisturbed birth is a process that is initiated spontaneously in unseen, unknown communication between the baby and the mother. And that triggers a cascade of hormones in the mother's brain that gives her the pain relief, the altered state, and the communication with her uterus that she needs for birth to begin. And I'm not romanticizing this when I say pain relief, because of course birth is a tremendously challenging experience. But what I'm saying is that physiological birth is triggered in the mother's brain, and it starts by flooding her brain with pain relieving, altered consciousness inducing hormones. So that's a key factor. The communication with her own uterus is then done in harmony with her particular physiology, her body, and her particular baby. So there's a call and response between the uterus, which sends signals to the brain that then produces more oxytocin, that then increases the strength of the contractions. And the baby participates in this, and your tissues mold and open accordingly. And this passage down the birth canal ends in a spontaneous ejection reflex, which you can't control. You can't push and you can't hold back if it's physiological undisturbed birth. It's like vomiting or pooing or having an orgasm. It's involuntary when it functions undisturbed and unobserved. And that's it, really. And then, the placenta is born usually within an hour, because if your instincts teach you, and your baby knows what it wants to do, wants to get to your breast, starts suckling your breast, you've got skin to skin, and your womb starts contracting and expels the placenta. So this is a normal physiological birth. And like you rightly say, this is very rarely seen in hospitals, and the vast majority of obstetricians have never seen an undisturbed birth or a spontaneous physiological birth. And also, like you say, most midwives haven't seen that today, because it is dependent on the production, primarily dependent on the production of the hormone oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, what we call love, attachment, the attachment hormone, and it's also the hormone that generates birth. And this is a shy hormone. This is a hormone that is generated during sex, for example. Where would you want to have sex? Would you want to have sex on a hospital ward under bright lights with several people in the room watching you, monitoring your performance, and saying, oh, I think we need to augment this process a bit because it's not moving along fast enough. It's very, very similar. So oxytocin is key. So the environment needed for this process to unfold is one where you would have sexual intercourse. What gets the baby in, gets the baby out.
It's one of the first things that our doula said to us. So a doula is somebody who can help you during birth. And our wonderful doula, she said, think about the kind of mood you want to have in order to reach an orgasm. That's the kind of mood that you want in the room in order to have the baby. And I think that this is what I didn't at all realize before I started learning more about this, is how, let's say, vulnerable or sensitive this process can be. And that, like you said, the things that would disturb you when you're trying to have sex, like, bright lights, people looking at you, people telling you what to do, that this will also, even if you mentally tell yourself that you are safe, I think that the body may still react with a sort of a contraction. And the body may still react with fear and with reducing this flow of oxytocin. So I think that was a big learning for me. But I do have many friends who have had good birth experiences in the hospital who have also given birth physiologically. So it is possible to do that also in a medical environment. Or what do you say about that?
It absolutely is. Of course it is. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's just, it's not that common. Because if we look at the statistics of interventions and iatrogenic injuries caused by the care provided in hospitals, if we look at that dispassionately, we see that there is an unnecessary degree of interventions. So why harm a woman when it's not necessary, basically? But yes, of course, many people have positive experiences in hospital. I'm not denying that at all. But too many women are having negative experiences in hospital. And this is now becoming blatantly apparent because traumatic birth is finally, the Me Too of traumatic birth experiences is happening as we speak. Certainly in the UK, which is what I'm most familiar with. We have an excellent MP, Theo Clark Kemp, who is currently raising this issue in the UK, of the prevalence of traumatic birth and that it is unacceptable to have a system that enables this to happen when it is not necessary.
Yeah,
and it is easily remedied.
So, let's get into that. So what do you see as sort of the major issues with maternity care in our systems today that lead to so many people having this experience of having traumatic birth experiences or suboptimal birth experiences? What do you think? What is the cause of that?
The problem,
or maybe also some examples of what? Yeah.
So the problem with the way the maternity services are structured in the West generally is that there is not choice. So the vast majority of women are still going to want to give birth in hospital because of the birth culture we're in, and that's something maybe we can discuss later. But the systemic problems are mainly related to the lack of choice, because the women who see that they wish to give birth outside of large-scale hospitals organized along lines of efficiency on basically principles taken from the car industry. I go into that in the book Revolution in the Maternity Factory as well. They would prefer to give birth in midwife-led units because they are smaller scale and you get a different environment. You get less risk of intervention because you don't have the efficiency pressure of getting people in and out through the system. It's more of a humane, human context where you give birth with a known midwife, someone you've actually seen during your pregnancy, because that boosts oxytocin in itself. You have a relationship. It's a relationship-based process. So we need independent midwife-led clinics. And in order to get the really great statistics, they need to be outside of hospitals. So ones that are adjacent to a hospital, like the one where I gave birth to my first child, don't get quite as good results as the ones that are outside of hospitals. This is a fact. So why is that? It's because you can't get the unnecessary interventions. They don't happen in the midwife-led clinics that are separate from hospitals. You can still be transferred to hospital at any moment. You know, if that's needed, you can be transferred to hospital. But you also need the choice of home birth because there are many valid reasons for choosing to give birth in the home. Of course, the woman's agency and her wish is the primary one, but there is also a vast body now of research evidence backing up the significance of the value, the validity of the choice of giving birth at home. For numerous reasons. Again, back to the oxytocin. What is the environment where you're going to feel the most relaxed and calm? Where do you go when you want to have a poo? You want to be a bit private, close the door, at home. You have the best poos at home. She's like, oh, thank God for that. But yeah, so it's very similar. That's where you open up. That's where you can really open up and relax and be yourself. You're familiar with all the impressions around you, the smells, the sights, the sounds, the energetic vibe of the place, if you like. And then, of course, there is also factors to consider for the baby, because the microbiome in the home is precisely the microbiome that your baby is going to receive when it hopefully passes through the birth canal, when its own microbiome is seeded. It needs to pass through the birth canal for its microbiome to be seeded, which is then supported perfectly, ultimately, by the mother's breast milk. So the mother's breast milk is designed exactly to support the microbiome the baby receives from its mother, and the microbiome in the home reflects that. And we know now the fundamental significance of a healthy microbiome for lifelong health factors involving both mental and physical health, diabetes, obesity, and so on. So we can't ignore that in the equation. So women who give birth at home, who want to give birth at home, are often extremely well-read, knowledgeable, and up-to-date with what the scientific evidence says, as well as their own intuition and feeling of agency and safety and so on. So we need a range of choices for all women. To try and force everyone into the same mold is what is harming women. And this is not about denying the value of hospitals, which is what you raised earlier on. There is an enormous value, and we should be so very grateful for the advances of Western medicine, both pharmaceuticals and surgical procedures, life-saving interventions during pregnancy and birth. But there is a fundamental factor that we haven't touched upon yet, which is that women who are pregnant and giving birth, the vast majority of them are not ill. And hospitals are simply the wrong place for those who are not ill and do not wish to be in hospital in the first place. So that is about between 75 and 80% of pregnant women in a Western environment are healthy. Yeah. So that leaves about 20% of women who should, be advised that it's wisest to give birth in hospital, because that's where the resources should be spent.
Yeah.
But this is not an efficient model for the way our maternity systems are set up. And they are set up the way they are because of the birth culture we live in. There are partly financial incentives and efficiency incentives, but it is also about our collective birth culture. So we can't just blame it all on politicians or hospitals or doctors or anything. It's more complex than that.
Well, if I can share a little bit about my own journey with this, and then we can, to make it more sort of tangible, and then we can circle back to those systems perhaps. So when I was pregnant, I felt very confident about my body. I felt good about the process. The only thing that I felt nervous about was the part about giving birth at the hospital. And like I mentioned, I had friends who had very good hospital experiences. I also had friends who had very bad hospital experiences. But I felt this very sort of visceral, I would say it was fear. I felt a visceral fear about going to the hospital. And I thought, well, it's strange that my body is reacting this way so strongly. I was thinking it's almost as if I've had a traumatic birth already. And then I realized, well, actually I had a traumatic birth already, which was my own birth when my mom gave birth to me. Because she had a terrible experience of, she wanted to have a physiological birth, but was not given really any support. And it was a classic sort of, unfortunately, it wasn't unique in the sense that these things, I think, happen to a lot of people. That the people who were working there that day were very stressed out. It had been Easter, and so people were totally overworked. The doctors were shouting at each other. They were shouting at her. They were arguing amongst themselves. And in the end, it ended in an emergency C-section. And since my mom had had a lot of drugs, she felt like she was not really present, and we were not together after the C-section and so on. And I think, there's something to be said about how things sort of lodge in the body and how the body remembers things. And so I thought, okay, this is obviously something that's important for me to pay attention to. My body is telling me that. And then as I didn't think that I wanted to have a home birth as my first birth, because the research that I had read up until then was saying that if you've already given birth before and it was uncomplicated, or actually at that point I hadn't even read any research. I just thought maybe it's best to start at the hospital, and then maybe later I could have a home birth. But then when I started researching this, I was so shocked by a few things. So the first one was that in the research, home births are very safe, especially if you've already given birth once before and it was uncomplicated. Then it's actually much safer to give birth at home, in the sense that you will have much less interventions, and not just a little bit, like a lot, it's twice as safe or something along those lines. So I thought, wow, this is very strange. And then it seems in the more recent research that even as a healthy first-time birther, it is also very safe to give birth at home, especially if you're, in case of an emergency, you can relocate to a hospital. And this is all, with having a home midwife that is there to help you. And so that was the first thing that shocked me. And I thought, well, maybe I should just try for the birth that I would really like to have from the very beginning, rather than have a bad experience first and then try to improve it the second time. So then I started looking for a midwife who could assist my home birth. And that was extremely difficult because there were basically no midwives who could do that. And as it turns out, especially the midwives in Uppsala, I was shocked to realize how much the systems and the doctors, to be honest, are working against them. So, for example, they will not issue the medication that the midwives need to take with them. And so I was shocked to learn of this level of animosity between the doctors, at least here in Uppsala, and the home midwives. So in the end, I did finally find a midwife that could help me, and I had my doula that I mentioned, and we had a home birth where I felt very safe and very held. And going back to what you were saying, I think that the most important thing for me was actually knowing my midwife, knowing who was going to be there to help me. And this is partly because when people hear that you've had a home birth, they say, oh, that's so lucky that it went well. How fortunate that it went well. And I feel that this aspect of luck and being fortunate is actually much stronger at the hospital, because if you go to the hospital, you never know who's going to be there, whether it's a stressful day for them, whether it's completely full and you'll be turned away. And, like you said, if we look at the physiology, leaving the cocoon of my home and going out into the cold winter of February would have, of course, also interrupted that process that would have started. So it all made a lot of sense to me. And then since I'm also I think like you, and interested in research, and I'm interested in what my body is telling me, but I'm also interested in what the research is telling me. So I don't understand, when you look at the research, how, like you said, having midwife-led clinics, having home births, there's strong support for this in the research. And recently in Uppsala, they have voted to instate this as a possibility, the midwife-led clinics and having home births that are paid for by the public system, which is not the case now. And the pushback against this has been enormous. And women who choose to have home births are seen as very selfish, and that, like, as if they want to have a cool experience or something that they can share on social media. So I am confused about the discrepancy between the research and the birth culture, as you talk about. And so I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that and the things that I was just talking about.
Well, the things that are coming up for me is, it's fear and control. So first of all, it's the fact that we are ignoring the fact that women who give birth the vast majority are healthy. They aren't ill. And we are handing them over to a system which is which is trained to deal with pathology and risk. So that's what doctors are trained to do, rightly so. But it's applied to the wrong field. It's applied to healthy people. So that's where part of the discrepancy. If you're constantly looking for a problem to arise, you're going to find one. If we analyze your body in great detail now, we're going to find pathologies. Yeah. And maybe you don't need to address all of them. So, a fundamentally healthy process is being interfered with unnecessarily. And one of the fundamental problems, I think, is also, this is again a remnant or an echo of what happened during the Enlightenment, when males took over the authority of over female processes, that doctors, the profession of doctors, which is a traditionally male one, has a much higher status than the profession of midwives. Midwives are there to support women emotionally and socially as well as medically. And that is not ranked as highly in our culture as the role of a doctor or an obstetrician who just comes in like a knight in shining armor and saves the day with his amazing or her amazing surgery skills or intervention skills. So there is that, and there is also, I think, in the system the wish to become a doctor or a midwife is based in wanting to help and support other people. And if that help and support, if what it looks like is actually staying out of the way, that requires quite a high degree of psychological development or spiritual sophistication. If the best help I can give this person is to stay out of the way as much as possible, close the door and leave the room. If you're in a hospital environment, that's not what you're trained to do. So I think that's part of the systemic problems.
And also that you will be criticized much more. That's what midwives have told me as well. You will be criticized much more for not doing something than for doing something that turns out to be unnecessary. So exactly. You should always err on the side of doing too much.
That's right. There's the whole litigation culture as well. Where you're doing things to prevent yourself from being litigated against. That spilt over from the US. The US is such a leader in terms of what healthcare looks like around the world. So hospitals, it's in their interests to ensure they are not litigated against. and no one in the hospital is blamed for anything. So structures are put in place to ensure that, but those structures end up harming the women they are supposed to serve.
So can we talk a little bit about that dynamic? So, because we could say, well, how could it possibly be wrong to just take every safety precaution? Isn't that a good thing? So talk to me a little bit about.
Well, let's start with when you come into a hospital and you're about to give birth. So CTG, is it called CTG in English?
I think so.
Yeah, you know what I mean, don't you? The electrodes you put on the on the belly to monitor the baby's heart rate. So these are a woman who comes into hospital who is determined to be in labor is given these electrodes as routine in many hospitals, probably in most hospitals in the Western world. That's the first intervention she gets. There is no evidence whatsoever that this improves outcomes. But it makes things easier for the hospital. They can say that they have monitored the baby's heartbeat from the minute she walks in the door, and they don't have to be with the woman all the time and be in relationship with the woman, i.e. feeling into her, listening to her, getting to know her, hearing her story. What does she think? What does she feel? You can go into another room and you can monitor several women at the same time from screens. So this is an efficiency principle, and there is no evidence that it improves outcomes for women. So you're hooked up to this machine. It's more difficult for you to move. It's more difficult for you to claim the space as your own and to move into the position that you want to be in when you're giving birth. And all the focus moves away from you as the agent of this miraculous process unfolding in your body towards the technology. So the apparatus is what becomes the authority in the room. And what often happens when women transfer to hospital, get this CTG put on them, and then have a vaginal examination to see how dilated they are, and may hear the information that, oh, you're only 2 centimeters dilated. This is very early. It's going to take ages. That you then get an emotional response in any normal person, which is like, oh, you know, I thought I'd already been through quite a large part of my labor. This was really quite painful and challenging already. So you're really minimizing the woman's importance and the value of the incredible work her body is doing as soon as she stepped in the door. And by changing environment from the home where her labor has started to the hospital, which is an unknown, unfamiliar environment with all these interventions, someone else's hands up your vagina and this machinery attached to you, it usually leads to labor stalling. So then you are determined to have weak contractions and the clock starts ticking. Whatever they say, the clock does start ticking because you're not going to be left in that position indeterminably. So eventually an intervention is going to be proposed, usually induction, or some women request epidurals as well. But this is really where the intervention cascade starts. It starts with the seemingly completely harmless CTG. You're just monitoring the baby's heart rate. What could possibly be wrong with that? But so your labor has stalled because of the transition to an unknown environment, the machinery that's on you, vaginal examinations that have to be done at regular intervals. So eventually, induction is going to come onto the table.
Induction, for people who don't know that word, that is when you receive, for example, hormones or other procedures in order to speed up or start the birth process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the induction of labor involves synthetic oxytocin being administered to the woman, which makes her womb contract and to restart the delivery or speed up the delivery. But there is a key difference, which is usually not highlighted and which most women are not informed of before they accept this induction. And that is, well, as we talked about earlier, your endogenous oxytocin that is produced in the pituitary gland in the brain floods your brain with trance-inducing hormones that make you feel like, ooh, like this, you go into this otherworldly state, and it's also pain relieving, and it communicates with your endorphins, your endogenous morphine, and melatonin. There's this hormonal cascade going on in your brain. It floods your brain with this, and that's what brings the woman into the altered state. The synthetic oxytocin is usually administered directly into a blood vessel, and the very clever blood-brain barrier does not allow this synthetic oxytocin to cross into the brain. So you, as the woman giving birth, you don't get any of the pain relief or the altered state from the synthetic oxytocin. It only communicates with your uterus, with your womb, and it makes your uterus contract to expel the baby. So the dance between your uterus and your pituitary gland, the oxytocin and the contractions, that is disrupted, and you are not getting your brain flooded with the bonding, the love hormone. You are only getting the contractions, which are not calibrated for your particular physiology. So they
can be stronger and more painful than the ones that would.
Yeah. So because they're not calibrated for your physiology, they can be experienced as much more painful. In fact, they frequently are. And because you're not getting the pain relief in your brain, the pain often becomes unendurable, and you then request an epidural because you're in an environment where interventions are available, and that is what you reach out for. It's the straw you clutch for. So you then ask for an epidural. You get your epidural, and you are then, you lose sensation from the waist down. You get pain relief, yes, and there is a right place for all these interventions. They can be life-saving and are absolutely correct in the right environment and the right situation. But what I'm describing here is an intervention cascade, which happens because of hospital routines, not because it's necessary in the individual case. So you have the epidural, you lose sensation of the very organs that are supposed to be birthing your baby, and then your contractions slow again. I'm not saying this always happens, but this is a frequent phenomenon known as the intervention cascade. So the contractions slow, so you have to increase the synthetic oxytocin. Your contractions increase in strength again, become more painful. You then have to up the epidural, and you then have to up the oxytocin, you have to up the epidural. This is the intervention cascade. And this frequently results in, as we'll see from the CTG, the baby starts to get distressed because it's being clamped down on with these synthetic contractions, and it's starting to affect the baby's oxygen uptake and heart rate. And that's when the danger zone is crossed and interventions come in for the actual birth itself. So either through the ventouse cup, I think it's called in English, the suction cup that you extract the baby with. Forceps aren't used that commonly anymore. And this is where we see the big birth injuries, which there has been a large increase in recent years because of these instrumentalized births. And that is a traumatic birth. Or you are transferred to emergency cesarean because the baby is in distress. And this is iatrogenic harm. This is caused by the system that is supposed to be caring for you. And then we can go on beyond the birth as well with the umbilical cord and the placenta, which is if you have an emergency cesarean or an acute situation during birth itself, you often get the cord cut immediately and the baby taken away to neonatal rescue or whatever it's called in English. For revival, and then the baby loses up to 30% of its own blood, which is contained in the placenta. So you obviously your baby's blood circulation is from the placenta to the umbilical cord to the baby's system until it starts oxygenating its own blood by breathing. So you should always wait to even touch the umbilical cord until it is white, completely white. Then all the baby's blood is in the baby's system and part of its new autonomous breathing and heart function. So this is the intervention cascade, and that can only happen in a hospital environment.
Yeah, and it's so it can sound very, detailed and perhaps new words for people who are not familiar with birth, but it is also important to talk about what is actually happening. And I think in order to understand what this really means, because it can also be very difficult, I think, sometimes for people to know, well, if the doctors say that this intervention is necessary, how can I say that it's not necessary? And I think that from what I've heard from midwives, in general, every midwife I met has been positive towards the idea of home birth, actually. And every doctor that I met have been very negative towards it. And it's interesting that the people who have the most experience of birth are, of course, midwives. It's interesting that they are listened to so very little in this context. But what I wanted to ask you is, there's several things. Isn't it true that there are situations where emergency help is needed? How can we really argue for people giving birth at home or in midwife-led birth centers when I think the feeling is that, well, in birth, anything could happen at any time? And isn't it then important to be prepared for emergencies?
Of course, that's why we have hospitals. But we have to look at what the research evidence actually says. That's why that is so important. We couldn't know about the safety of home birth or midwife-led clinics or hospital birth without academic research, and that's a very important factor in making good decisions around birth. And like you touched upon earlier, there's a huge body of research on the safety of birth. Birthplace UK is one of them. In the Cochrane Review, there's a systematic review of all the evidence that anyone can access and read up on. And that's where the evidence that you mentioned earlier comes from. And it's clear. It's absolutely crystal clear. So to me, the question isn't really about what the research says about the safety of birth outside of a hospital. The real question is, why are we preventing women from having access to evidence-based care?
What's the answer?
Well, this is where we come to the heart of the matter of the birth culture.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because I think this is not, I'm way beyond being mad at the system or politicians or the media or doctors.
Oh, I'm not.
You're not. I can be that as well. But really, it is about what our collectively held unconscious beliefs about the intelligence of the ecosystem of which we are an integral part. We are not separate from the biosphere. We are the biosphere. Our bodies are a biosphere. And it is our view of nature as a resource for extracting value for self-enhancement that lies at the heart of the problem, because the way we view the planet and the way we view nature, our mother, that is how we view woman and females. And this is largely unconscious. And this is the shift that we've gone from this vulva-centric, birth-centric 13-month cycles in harmony with the heavenly bodies, the moon, the sun, the stars, the planet itself, of actually living as an embodied integral part of that whole and taking ourselves as human outside of that whole and viewing the rest of the world as a resource for personal betterment, advancement, capitalism, if you like, the technocratic model, if you like, techno-feudalism was what's happening now. But that is really key for me, that we view the female as a resource to be exploited, but it's unconscious. And this is the issue of the birth culture, that it's upheld by so many women. And especially if you yourself have had a traumatic experience in a hospital, you've been a good girl all your life, worked hard at school, really tried to be good at your job, as we're trained to be, but to be a people pleaser and do well and do things right. You've done everything right. And you've done what the doctors told you. You've done the safe thing, the right thing that people expect of you and everyone tells you is the right thing. And still you end up with this diminishing, traumatizing, maybe even physically damaging experience. It takes a very strong person to see that maybe this didn't have to happen. It's hard, very hard to accept that. And it is in fact easier to accept the narrative that if I wouldn't have gone to hospital, if I wouldn't have been in hospital, me and my baby would have died, because that is a narrative that is going to get you sympathy, acceptance, and being told that you've done the right thing. But if you choose to liberate yourself from that narrative and see that things could have been done differently, and perhaps next time I can have a different experience, that takes a degree of courage that is unusual, because you are going against the shared view of truth. And that's why I think spiritual training, that really helped me, because you are trained to look at things from a bigger picture than the particular civilization and culture that we are in at the moment. And so the birth culture in our civilization is largely upheld by the women who participate in it, the women who are midwives in it, the women who are obstetricians in it, the women who are in the media in it, the women who are politicians in it. So this is absolutely not something we can blame on patriarchal culture in the sense of it's men doing this to us. It's not. We're doing this to ourselves.
It's very interesting. And it makes me think about people listening to this who may perhaps feel that, well, I did have interventions during my birth, or I did have a cesarean, but I felt that it was a beautiful birth, and that I was also not less of a woman because of the way that I gave birth. Do you see what I mean? What do you think about that?
Of course, every birth is a spiritual initiation, regardless of how it takes place, and an existential rite of passage. So you can't. That's not what I'm denying at all.
No, it's good, but you can maybe, because I think that sometimes when we talk about physiological births, there is this hierarchy where if you have a physiological birth at home, for example, in one way it's seen as this sort of irresponsible thing, but in another way it's seen as sort of the most womanly and natural and best thing you could do. And then if you've had some interventions, that's slightly worse. And then if you've had to have a cesarean, then it's that you weren't in touch with your body and et cetera, et cetera. And it's not as, womanly or connected with yourself, sort of. So what do you think about when people feel that?
I think we have to distinguish about what someone is doing on an individual level and what is happening at group level, because it's at group level that we create the structures that then deny some women choice. So at individual, I think a good birth is a birth where the woman has chosen herself how she wants to give birth and is standing in her power when she's giving birth and doing it on her own terms, the way she wants to do it. If that is in a hospital ward or in a barn, that's irrelevant. It's the fact that choice is denied to women, and it's not even evidence. There's no evidence to back it up. So, a rite of passage is something that occurs regardless of whether you are conscious of it or not, and regardless of the circumstances in which it happens. And what I am advocating is that a woman should have optimal autonomy and choice in orchestrating her rite of passage on her terms.
And to be held and supported in that.
Yeah. And if, so if she's having a cesarean section for whatever reasons, if it's a matter of an elective cesarean because maybe she's the victim of child abuse, or for whatever reason, it's absolutely key to her that this is how she gives birth, then we as a society do everything to support her in making that experience transformational on her terms and strengthening and empowering. And likewise, if a woman wants to have an epidural from the word go, then all the facilities are already in place for this, you see. So the fact that I am raising what is lacking in our society doesn't mean that I'm denying the value of other people's choices or the systems that are in place for very good reason.
Yeah.
It's just the lack of choice and awareness that I'm trying to shed some light on.
Yeah, and I think that there's it's interesting that when we say that women should have autonomy and women should have power to choose in these kinds of situations, some people will interpret that as saying that, well, then it's the women's fault if something goes wrong. Do you see what I mean? Or like people don't want to take that. For some women, I think they also feel that the responsibility is too much, and that they feel that, well, if I can have the power over this, that means that if it doesn't turn out the way that I hope, then that was my fault. And
100%.
And then what I've been trying, and I was worried about that too. I was afraid to hope for the best possible outcome because I thought I will be even more disappointed afterwards and perhaps blame myself for that. And then in the end, I'm very glad that I did do that, and it was only possible with the support of some important people and the support of my partner. But I think there's something about that when we say that women have the power to, or when we say that women should have the power to decide for themselves in this situation, we also have to realize that at the moment, like you say, the structures are not in place at all to support that. So if you are trying to have a physiological birth, for example, at the hospital, and that's what you want, and then that doesn't happen, that doesn't mean that this is your fault, because it can mean all kinds of things. Sometimes it's not possible, or perhaps you were not supported in it, or et cetera, et cetera. So there's something about this complicated issue because people feel so strongly about it. People feel like, I know my mom felt so disappointed that she wasn't able to have a physiological birth. And in her case, it was so obvious that, I don't know how she could have in that situation with people screaming at her and so on. So it's such a sensitive and vulnerable thing, because it's so personal and it can affect us so much in how we begin our journey as mothers as well.
Absolutely. And it's extremely important to remember that we are fortunate enough to live in a society where we can choose to not take responsibility. And that is an equally valid choice to choose. I don't want to take responsibility. I want the system to tell me what to do. That is what I really wish to do. Mm-hmm. And I think it's wonderful that is also a possibility. So it's the range of choice, the diversity of choice that is lacking.
Yeah.
And you're right, to take responsibility is a big thing. And that's why I'm saying it's going to remain a minority of women until we are forced by circumstances in the wider world, maybe. It's going to remain a minority of women who want to take that degree of responsibility for their births. Mm. But those who do wish to do that should not be prevented from doing that.
Yeah. And so if we, sorry for that slight detour, it was really helpful to have you clarify that. If we return to this bigger question of the birth culture and so on. What I've seen as well in terms of how our relationship to nature is one of control. Usually, we don't know how to deal with, the wildness, the uncertainty of natural processes. And so when it comes to a lot of things, when it comes to how we grow our food, when it comes to birth as well, instead of creating the conditions for the result that we want to arise naturally, we try to force the result that we want. And then when we force things and try to control every single element, then instead we will have all these unintended consequences. Like if we are doing monoculture, then we will spray pesticides everywhere, and then we will have a very efficient crop in one sense, but we will also kill all of these other insects that perhaps have other roles in the ecosystem. And so there's something about that, these subtle things that cannot be measured, that disappear when we are so focused on measuring and intervening in these processes. I don't know what question I wanted to ask from that, but
I'm thinking one of the things that's coming up for me is that the hands-on skills, the craftswomanship, if you like, of the independent midwife are in danger of being lost in our civilization and birth culture. And that is because we aren't interacting directly with reality, and because of what you say, that we are trying to control reality and trying to control physiological and natural processes to the degree that we are losing our relationship with them, this dance between what happens in the outside world and what our reaction to it is. So independent home birth midwives work with all sorts of situations, like, shoulder dystocia is considered a very serious complication during birth.
That's when the shoulder of the baby gets stuck in the vaginal opening.
Exactly, yeah. But a skilled independent home birth midwife can handle that situation without any surgical or medical intervention because of her vast knowledge of how individual women respond to different factors, and by changing her position and her hands-on craftswomanship, as I call it. Mm-hmm. Or the same with, say a breech birth in the home. Now in hospital, it's often considered a factor for cesarean section, because we are losing, what I'm trying to say is we are losing these hands-on skills because we are losing our direct visceral relationship with nature. And these are going to be absolutely essential as we move into the future. If we are moving towards the world of living in smaller communities in more harmony with nature, whether we are forced to do it by what happens to the planet and in the world, or whether we choose to do it out of an understanding that it is unsustainable to go on as we have, we are going to need these skills. They are the true measure of safety of our culture. If we can give birth and bring new life into the world in relationship with each other, with the bodies we have, with the herbs that grow around us, and with our intelligent minds and bodies working in harmony and collaboration with each other. So to rely on the increasing technologization of our society and civilization is not the safest option going forward. And that does not mean that you want to eliminate hospital cares or pharmaceuticals. It's not saying that at all. But we must preserve these millennia-old skills that are passed from woman to woman and then consolidated and integrated into a biological knowing of an independent midwife. These women should be lecturing in the universities to the obstetricians and midwives to give them an extra skill. the icing on the cake on top of all their intellectual, academic knowledge, not something to be oppressed or try to be eliminated from our society because it threatens the status quo. We need to re-find some sort of balance here, because it is safer for us all in the long run to not be detached from nature and from ourselves.
Yeah, and it's being detached from oneself too, and from nature. It's such an impoverished life in so many ways, and it's like you say, the embodied knowledge and the experiential knowledge that cannot be measured in the same way, that can't be easily transmitted even. I mean, yeah, it's just experience of seeing hundreds and hundreds of births. I mean, it's going to do that, and this is what the Swedish philosopher Jonna Bornemark, she talks as well about this, using our good judgment as people with experience, that they have this capacity for doing that is not recognized, of course, in hospitals where you're supposed to follow protocols, and perhaps not use. It's challenging to rely on your own judgment. I can understand that in a hospital context that can feel difficult. But so what would you say is a good way to begin to reattach ourselves, to emerge ourselves, and to connect with our bodies? Because this is not just for birth. I mean, this is just something that can help us in a lot of ways.
Well, I'm just thinking of your own daughter,
Mm-hmm.
born in this environment, in this microbiome,
right next to you.
Here, right next to where I'm sitting, in this beautiful farmland and forest with traditional wooden buildings all around. She's going to grow up much more connected with the physical, natural environment than she would have done if she would have given birth in a hospital in a city and so on, maybe taking her to a nursery or whatever in another city environment. So it starts there. But really, my work, like I said, has gone through many iterations of trying to influence the world around me in as positive a way as I'm capable of during my short lifetime. But really, I think at puberty, my wish is that both boys and girls at puberty learn about the physiology of birth and the importance of hormones, because this is not really a women's issue. This is not about women, about women specifically, because every single person is born, and how that happens matters profoundly for them and as an individual, and for us as a society. So my wish is that when young people reach puberty, they are taught about oxytocin, about the hormonal fireworks that happens in your body as you sexually mature, and how the menstrual cycle plays out, and how it's in harmony with cosmic cycles and the cycles of the planet, and then how the relationship of that is with birth. And the seasons, the seasons of the menstrual cycle, the seasons of the year, how these are connected, how we are not separate from nature, and that the only option given girls and women as they move into adulthood and the workplace isn't just to get rid of those symptoms of cyclicality, because they are what keeps us in harmony with the biosphere, the greater biosphere. The smaller biosphere harmonizes with the greater biosphere. And if you are just told to take paracetamol to get rid of your menstrual cramps, or if you go on the pill to get rid of your actual menstrual cycle, that's where you're starting to detach yourself. So by the time you get pregnant and are going to go into hospital, you are already detached, both yourself from the cyclicality of all the creative spark of life-givingness, but also your partner, the boys growing up in this culture are also disconnected from it because they're not aware or informed of the significance of this cyclicality. Right. And so I've come to the conclusion that it's too late to start preparing for birth in the few months before birth. It's something we need to do collectively much earlier by honoring the value of cyclicality of the seasons and the cyclicality of the female body, and ultimately the miracle of birth, where one cosmos reaches another cosmos. You are the cosmos. Woman is the entire universe for this new life. And she is the conduit, the channel that brings one cosmos out of another. And that's why it's a rite of passage, because if you pause for a moment to think of the mystery of the seed or the mystery of birth, you cannot but be filled with awe and humility in the face of the miracle in the midst of which we exist. So I think that is key for transforming our birth culture. And then, of course, it goes on to menopause and, all these cyclical changes. We live in a changing landscape, a changing world, in changing bodies. And it's about the comfort, the willingness to get comfortable with change. This civilization is built on linear principles of always performing at the same level or at an increasing level, but not on cyclical wave-based principles of flow. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems. So if there's one thing I could do is I wish I could speak, maybe, or not me personally, but we could speak to young boys and girls when they hit puberty and teach them about the miracle of birth.
We have no exposure to it really in our culture now today, except for the dramatic births on TV. So I think that would absolutely be a beginning way of shifting things. Thank you so much for KRISTINA for coming and having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for creating this beautiful environment.
You'll find links to the things we talked about, including several of the scientific studies we mention, in the episode description. I know that birth brings up a lot of feelings. It certainly does for me. I hope you found something useful in this episode, whether or not it corresponds to your own experiences and views. This was the third episode in the Blood Mystery series, which explores the interweaving of the biological, emotional, and spiritual in the context of women's bodies. You can find previous episodes via links in the description or wherever you listen to podcasts. I really want to stay in touch with you outside of social media and Meta's grip, so please make sure to follow the show in your podcast app, or even better, sign up for the free newsletter at forestofthought.substack.com, and you'll receive new episodes, essays, and events straight to your inbox. You can also provide deeply appreciated support for the show via Patreon or Substack. All the info is in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.